I don't think you're actually. I don't think you're actually scaremongering them. I think we've got a crisis amongst the car parks. I think car parks built certainly, post-war through into the early 80s have got a problem. A car park that could hold 500,000 up to 3,000 cars. The structure is pretty poor.
Good afternoon and welcome to this very special edition of it's not even Demolition Live. This is Mike Kehoe at C&D Consultancy Live, brought to you by Amicus Insurance. I'm not going to be around for much of this. I'm going to hand over to our expert in the field, Mike Kehoe of C&D Consultancy. The subject up for Mike's presentation is car park demolition. I'm going to be tuning in because I'd like to know exactly why car park demolition is the specialist field that it is. So before we go any further, let's get Mike on the stream.
So a little bit expert in the art of demolition, and a big thanks to our sponsors for today, who the insurance who's kindly donated some monies towards this presentation, and they've sponsored it. So Amicus, big thanks for you for that one to move forward. They delivered all types of insurance for the industry, so a well-known company there. So many thanks for them. So if we could, a little bit about what we're going to do today. We're going to look a little bit about the history of multi-storey car parks. We're definitely going to talk about the construction, because I think it's vitally important that if we know how they're built, we as demolition people can take them down, or why they fail and how they fail, different demolition techniques that we're going to go through. Did a little bit of a lecture last week on strength points in buildings. So we'll look a little bit about how buildings are strong and how we can work towards them, how they've failed in the past, and certainly we're going to look at really good practice in demolition. Thankfully, we've got some really good case studies as we go through this one. A little bit about the history of multi-storey car parks. You can see there, as early as 1901, multi-storey car parks were started to be built in the UK. One of the earliest multi-storey car parks built 2002, 2003 in London. And we've got Botanic Gardens, Glasgow, which will be on the next slide, which is a distinctive facade on the next picture. So if we could turn that, move on to the next one. And also we've got the multi-storey car park from in there. So why are multi-storey car parks, and certainly what we're dealing with today, why are they a big problem in the industry? Well, certainly after the Second World War, city centre, go back a slide, sorry. Angela? Just go back a slide, sorry. So, as we can see, after Second World War, the government tried to pump a lot of money into city centre and city centre locations. And one of the things that they gave grants to and large incentives was for car parks. Obviously, wanted to get people into the city centres. So a lot of money was put in place and a lot of grants were put in place, certainly into the car parks. Unfortunately, with most things, a lot of money was put in. It was non-regulated. So once that was in from in there, people were given large grants of money to build car parks. So moving to the next slide. We can see here on the right-hand side was the lift slab construction. This is one that comes from, as it says before, the number of columns are built, it's erected, and then the floors are jacked into place, and in certain cases either welded in place or is held together on a form of a column head. Number of car parks were all constructed using lightweight concrete planks lifted into place, using a number of sections such as reinforcing, dowel bars, and obviously putting the structures in place. Finally, at the bottom there, we can look at cast slab structures. Car parks have been cast from formwork, generally off a central core, with either a lift shaft or a central stairwell in place. Now, on the picture we can see from in there, it was an American design, lift slab car parks structure, and then it came over into the UK, and then it was regulated into the UK. The reason why that was done is you can see a very small space, very small footprint, seeing multiple car spaces being available to do some demolition on there, well, or later on for us to do some demolition. But at this stage here, they're constructing the car parks out of small space using new concrete techniques. Okay. Next slide. We can see the slide there from how it's being built. Central core, lift slab design, first as said, introduced in America, brought over to the UK. What's unusual for us as demolition in the demolition industry is where will the core be when we come to demolish it? Generally, when we're demolishing buildings, where we see a strength point such as a core, a lift shaft, or a stairwell, we tend to see them centrally within the building. Well, we're going to see as we go through the presentation today that the core, or the core area, is going to be to one side of the building. Now, this makes it slightly difficult for us when we demolish it, because if we're working back to a strength point, and we'll always look to our strength points being either a lift shaft, shear wall, or a stairwell, if it's in the centre of the building, we're able to work into the building or to that point. Generally on a car park, because it's not in the centre, because it needs the cars to go up, because of the footprint of the car park, it's generally to the side of it, which gives us a slightly weaker building when we're coming to demolish it. So that will come up a little bit later on the slides when we see that, but we can bear in mind there's a good example there of where the strength point of a lift slab car park will be. Okay, next slide, please. Now, we're going to see a little video here of a very lucky person, if it loads, of a car park failure.
Wow.
Okay. So, our guy survived through onto that one from in there. Where was he standing? He was standing on the stairwell. And where we talked about before about stairwells being our strength point, we can see that the car park failed, but the central core and the stairwell stayed in place. So a lot of car parks, as we know, are failing around the world. This one completely failed in a catastrophic failure. All right, if we can move on to the next one, Hans, please. Okay. So I talked about a little bit earlier about car parks. I talked a little bit about how the government was incentivising car parks to be built into the city centres. And if you can imagine back into sort of post-war, 1946, 1947, the types of cars that may possibly go into car parks would definitely change today. But some of those car parks, as we know, are still in operation. So we've got to be mindful of the type of car parks we're going to be taking down and how they were constructed and why they were constructed. Okay, so any of our people listening to Mark's show today and ourselves will know that a number of different types of regulations in terms of for buildings are currently being up operation. But in the UK, first sort of tentative building regulations were introduced around about 1964, came into operation around about 1965. Building codes, building regulations started to be enforced circa 1972. So we've got a sort of section there of about 20 years post-war, government incentives, and then we've got a situation that car parks were being built without any real regulations or building control. So how were they designed? They were designed by architects, a standard design, signed off by an architect, and obviously given to a number of building companies, local authorities, private individuals to build car parks. And again, what we've got to be mindful, we've got no regulations, we've got no building codes, we've got no standards for steels, etc. So we've got a perfect storm where a car park's getting built, but we've actually got no real building regulations or design drawings from there. So built up on a sort of schematic plan, built up one design generally from the lift slab or a precast concrete frame without any regulations. So we've got an issue when we come to do car parks at a later stage to demolish them. We actually got no as-built drawings, we've got no design, and we don't know if there's any real reinforcing been put in place. Okay, next one, please. Okay. What we've also found in the past, there was a number of cases in the UK where a number of unscrupulous construction methods and unscrupulous developers had put car parks up, and they put them up at the lowest cost, at the lowest price, and in many cases we'll see later on, we've actually found that car parks were built, actually in operation, that actually contain no reinforcing put into it. And we're going to see a famous collapse a little bit later on where we see some of the car parks in there. So I've talked a little bit about pre-1972, when a vast number of car parks were built. Okay, we can see here on the photograph is generally A lot of car parks in the UK, how they're designed, they're basically put with a central column, put like a little bit of a column head on it. And obviously we've got a situation where we've got two large concrete trusses sitting on there. And believe it or not, they're not supported with any reinforcing. There is a very, very thin piece of reinforcing going across the top of the plank, and that's basically holding it all together. It's held together on gravity with some dowels. And what we've also got in there is we've got a system of very poor constructed designs, poor maintenance regime, and a real bad deterioration of concrete and the concrete slab. So with car parks, we've almost got a perfect storm in terms of construction. Poorly constructed, unscrupulous methods to get them in place, a number of designs not suitable. We've now got a situation that we designed for cars in 1970s, 1960s, and we've got a completely different one. And we've also got 40 or 50 years worth of corrosion being undertaken. So it's a real difficult one for us for car parks in the future. I would imagine the vast number of car parks in the UK will start to have to be demolished. Okay. Again, why do car parks fail? Well, we can see here we've got a real nice crack in the concrete plank, changes in the weather conditions, accumulations of snow and ice, stability of the car park, warmer summers, colder winters. We've also got the things such as when we put on anti-weather solutions, such as to prevent ice, those solutions are absorbed into the concrete and the concrete starts to fail. So it's a real difficult one from in there. We've got a number of factors from in there, okay? Why other reasons fail, okay? Incorrect steel fabrication. There was no coatings of the steel back in the early designs of car parks. Different types of steel was put into the building. And also, if you look at the little picture and diagram, the photograph there, sorry, that is all the reinforcing that was holding a truss and column across there. Okay, so very, very small amounts of reinforcing was actually put in. This was a failing car park in Hammersmith in London, which myself was the engineer on, and DDS Demolition carried out the demolition. When we got onto the site, we were shocked at the lack of reinforcing that was in there. So, a little bit of description of a lift slab. What happens there is we can see a central concrete column in place. And what happens there is they jack the floor systems into place. And those little sections the welders welded in place held the floor in place. So when we park our big Range Rover or Mark's Lamborghini in the car park, what we've got to see here is that it's only supported in some cases by a small steel frame, a steel column, or in this case, it's actually just been welded into place. Now, you wouldn't believe that our car park was being welded into place when we're in there. And that was the problem. Now, what we also found is that a number of the steel and the steel gauges and the reinforcing were welded together at the initial implication of building. Also, that weld failed because they were using the wrong welding, they were using the wrong steel, and they were using the wrong gauge of steel. So again, another perfect storm on the top of our column head. And as we talk a little bit later on about the famous Piper's Row collapse, we'll talk about how column heads have failed in car parks. So a little classic example there why also car parks fail. So certainly these car parks were not designed for the loads that we undertake today. You talk about, you know, heavy cars coming in, larger, heavier cars from their bigger engines. So we've got, again, another factor of why a lot of car park and weight and strain are affected onto the car parks. Okay, so I hope I'll give a little bit of a flavour of what and how car parks are about, and also about a little bit of why they fail. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about a little bit later on. But most car parks, most buildings and car parks that we're going to undertake have been taken down generally because they're in failure. And if you look around, we've had recent collapses in Canada, America. There's been a famous one in Spain. and we've had several in the UK, which we'll talk a little bit later on from there. So around the world, we've got a situation where car parks are failing. By nature, they're built in city centre, town centres, built up areas to attract cars and people into the area. We've got a difficult situation that our strength points are not in a central core position. And our strength points are lift shafts, stairwells, as any demolition structural engineers will know. They're the ones that we work back to in demolition. Okay, not located centrally, so we've got a really difficult one in there. And generally, large areas of the structure are therefore unstable away from the strength point. So we've got, again, a difficult one is when we're starting to take a concrete car park down, we've got some real challenges ahead of us. Okay.
Just before you move on, Mike, can I just interject slightly?
Yeah.
I know, so monitoring the system that they've got in the States, there's been a big program there of structural analysis of their bridges. Given what you've said and given the age and given the apparently faulty state of a lot of our car parks, should we not have that sort of system here in the UK, or does that exist?
Well, there was, after the Pipers Row collapse in 1977, the HSE undertook a review and asked a number of engineering companies, as well as the British Car Park Association, to undertake a number of reviews. And as we go through the presentation, we will see some of the findings of what they've asked for from in there. However, there is not a standardised car park regime, but it's well known. Each of the failures, as we talk through, the failures in America, the failures in Spain, the failure in Canada recently, are all the same traits as we go through. So there's no real difference of what we go through. It's a bit like we've talked about before, Mark, about power stations, very similar in the States as they are over here. The car park failure is the same sort of systematic failures of design, maintenance, and how these are put together. So as we go through, I've indicated a number of areas that I see as a demolition engineer we should be looking for prior to demolition. In terms of structural integrity of the car parks, I think local authorities, I think the government, and certainly the Car Park Association need to have a like-minded heads together of how they're going to deal with these car parks, because I don't know about other demolition contractors who were watching this or other demolition consultants, but my inbox is quite full with car park demolition. So, and future car parks that are under failure. And if you check around the car parks as we go in, a lot of our people certainly watching this one will notice that a lot of cracking. They're starting to delaminate the concrete, and we're starting to see the reinforcing coming through, and which then starts to pose a problem. Then we have to start propping the car parks ready for demolition, and then we get into an all new structural dynamics of how a car park is going to be brought down. So, Angela, if you could play the video of a traditional method of a top-down car park. And stop it there. Okay, so what we'll carry on letting the video run. One of the things we can see here now is a second type of engineering work that DDS had put into the car park. I don't know if you noticed when you first seen it, they were doing some sacrificial propping underneath the floors, and on here they've actually built up the columns. So the concrete columns have been built up, and they've actually built in a column head, which is there. So what we can see is there they've actually designed a loading base for the flooring. So as the flooring comes away, we're not going to produce a punch and shear failure, or the columns are not going to punch up through the floors. So bear in mind, sometimes, even though we're doing a top-down demolition, we now got to go back and think about the structural loading, how the building's going to react under demolition, because that's what we're here to do, is talk about demolition, how buildings react under demolition, especially car parks, and how and where it will fail. So they've had to produce a large number of engineering disciplines in there to keep the building up strong under demolition. Otherwise, as we know before, and we'll see it a little bit later on with the Elvenite South End demolition, a catastrophic failure of the whole building can concern. So if you can continue with that video, Ange, please. Okay, so a bit of a technique there of top-down demolition. One of the things that we're going to talk a little bit about is how we control the risks around demolition, especially car parks. Okay, seen in that video, we've seen two propping systems. And we've got to look about car parks as how the load is going to be transferred to floors. Is there going to be any punch and shear failure? Is the columns going to punch through the slab? Okay, how are we going to back prop it? What sort of leading edge problems are we going to have it? How are we going to get the materials down from the top floor onto there? Because we've seen a number of car parks that are under demolition that have failed because of loading of the hardcore on the floors. As you noticed on the DDS one there, they were pulling the hardcore straight off the floor as soon as it accumulated. Okay, how can we prevent catastrophic failure? Well, one of the things we need to ensure is that we get the structural loading done before we start the demolition. How would scaffolding affect the demolition? Well, we've had a number of scaffolding failures around buildings recently, around buildings where the scaffolding's been affected by the demolition. So how is scaffolding going to keep us enclosed in the top down? And how would you demolish the building using the strength points? Well, we talked about before about the strength points being the lift shafts and the central cores being slightly offset. All right. Typical top-down demolition as we're looking at here. Scaffolding around the outside, flame retardant, monoflex all the way around there. Internal drop zones. Generally, the lift shafts will use the lift shafts to take the materials down from top floor to bottom if they've got a lift shaft. Materials removed by small excavators from in there. So it's vital that we talk about, when we talk about top-down demolition for car parks, is because we know that there's a risk of catastrophic failure. How are we going to prevent that being done? Okay, is it by a case of putting things such as propping? Are we going to have to prop through the building? Where do we prop? Are we going to back prop 1 floor, 3 floors, or are we going to prop the whole building, which we've done in the past, all the way back into back to slab level? Right. So I think what we've got to be mindful now is how we're starting to think about the demolition of a car park. It's come clear now with these slides is that we need to get the right structural advice and loadings before we start one. Okay, it's no good thinking how we're going to do it. And also remember that the car parks we're taking down are in failure or starting to fail. So what loadings would a mini excavator, a Brock, or certain other techniques we use, a Bobcat, be able to use? What point loading are we going to put onto there? There's a number of tests we can do to carry that out. Okay, great thing. NFDC have done some guidance for top-down. Not specific guidance on car parks, but the top-down guidance is a really useful tool that we can use, and it demonstrates a number of areas that we can work towards before. So anyone undertaking a car park demolition, certainly have a look about the free NFDC guidance of National Federation of Demolition Contractors on their website. You can easily access some of that information. It's really good access, written by demolition professionals, so it's easy to understand. Certainly one that you would want to put in your file, or one of your site managers would certainly want to read before they start the demolition. Okay. Again, a number of techniques we can use for top down. Again, using a Brock, I use a mini excavator with a hammer, and we'll be using Bobcats, etc., to move stuff around. Okay, just some certain techniques to do. But the important thing here is that we understand how we're going to do the work and how we're going to bring it down with its load paths. Okay. So, really different type of technique that we're going to be using on a car park. This was a large car park in the centre of Warrington. Mark Bryant from JBV and Warrington Borough Council both appointed me to come and be an independent engineer on this one. The car park was in failure, and the number of reasons why the car park was in failure: poorly built. It had a failing reinforcing within the building. It was getting large cracks, and it was starting to sag in certain areas. So they asked me for my advice, and my advice is this one, is that we as demolition contractors, certainly consultants or contractors, need to be forceful here. Because I went back to the local authority and said, well, the best thing you need to do on here is to create an exclusion zone, close the roads off around it, pick a weekend you need to do, and bring it down over a weekend. And they said, why is that? I said, well, if we were to go in and do explosive demolition, we're going to have to send men in to drill the holes. We're going to have to spend a lot of time and effort to get it right. And we're going to put people at risk because they're already in there. If we're going to take it down by top down, we've then got to put a lot of people inside there to back prop it. The problem with back propping it, if there's a failure, doesn't matter how much back propping we put in there, it can fail. So I suggested that we create an exclusion zone. We completely seal the whole area off, and JBV had worked out a program to get it down over the weekend. And if you move on to the next slide. So the yellow denotes the car park. The red is the exclusion. Now, we have been involved in quite a few explosive demolitions over the years. So we basically treated this as an explosive demolition, created the exclusion zone, got everybody out of the exclusion zone in the area, and we sealed it off. We worked over a weekend. We had it planned. We got a meticulous plan, and JBV thankfully had a large arsenal of plants and machinery that could bring it down on the weekend. So it went really well. What we did here is we marked up a series of areas where a number of machines would go to. So a number of machines was tasked with taking down a number of numbered areas. And if you can see in the top left-hand side of the screen where number 6 and number 7 is there was our strength point. And our strength point there was a sheared wall, was 2 lifts, and was also a stairwell. all in the one area. So we worked back to that point there. So we took the car park down, we left it to that point there, because that was our strength point. Again, normally, if it was a normal building, our strength point would be somewhere around about in areas 14, 16, 18, round about the middle there. But unfortunately, with car parks, because they don't want to have the central core in, because they'll lose car parking space, it's generally shoved into a corner. So we worked on this one there. We had a dual approach. We took it on a number of 4 areas. So we've been from there. So if Angela, if you move on to the next slide for me, please. So there, we're starting to take it away from there. As you can see, on the top left-hand side, I've left the lift shaft in place, the central core, to give us some strength as we take through the building. Again, only held in by gravity. The planks were held in by some dowels, and one piece of reinforcing, the very, very small piece of reinforcing, held the car park slabs in place. Thankfully, as we go through the slides, carried on working through the night, as again, another central strength point on there we've left in place. Angela, next one, please. And again, as we went through, we got it down over the weekend. Now, for contractors out there who's tasked with a tender for a car park or demolition consultants around there, one of the things that I think we need to do as an industry is to say to people who have the car parks for demolition, we know that they're going to fail. We can get on the internet. If you look on the internet, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of car parks around the world failing. So we know they're failing. So we have got information that tells us they're failing. So what we've done here is we created an exclusion zone. We got enough planting machinery to bring it down in the weekend, a bit like a bridge over a motorway, which people have been doing it down there. And we got it down safely. Traffic was only interrupted for one weekend, the bulk of it on the Sunday. We got it cleared away, and actually on the Sunday morning, we'd actually opened the road because we'd had it down over the Saturday night. A really, really successful, forward-thinking Borough Council allowed us to close the roads off them in there. Car park was in failure, so it was a good example of a good technique for them to close it down, one that went really well. So I think we as an industry, we as consultants, the National Federation of Demolition Contractors, Institute of Demolition Engineers, anyone working alongside the car park or a client needs to say that the best way to do is to close the surrounding roads off, get the car park down safely, because if we do it where there's people coming past there, we put scaffolding, we put hoarding around there, there is a chance of a catastrophic failure. Right? So I think my advice is to do on here was to close it off, seal it down, and to produce an exclusion zone. Okay, so we're talking about different types of techniques. I talk a lot about in my lectures about strength points of buildings, because my only thing is how we're going to bring it down. So, but how to bring it down, we know how they've been built, right? A lot of car parks have got central points, little strength points. Again, a lot of buildings were used on gravity. So they basically put a plank on, put a very, very small piece of reinforcing in, and joined it together, and gravity held it in place. All right. Next one, Angela, please. Okay, go one back, sorry. Okay. As we can see over the years, a number of buildings, especially the car parks, starting to fail. The concrete's starting to crack. And we do have, if we move on to the next one, Angela, sorry. We do have such things like this what happens, right? Where we get a failure. Okay, we get a failure of a car park. Okay. We get a complete catastrophic failure. We've also had partial collapses. We've had some localized failures of supporting beams. Okay. And also huge amount of backprop and engineering solutions once we find there's a failure to bring it down in a top down. So car parks are posing real problems to us moving forward to the demolition industry. Yeah. So let's have a look a little bit about some good practice going forward. What can we do to ensure that when we are going to take down a car park, we don't have a failure? We don't want any one of our brother demolition people around the world to be injured. There's enough people's been injured and hurt over the last few years. It's something we desperately want to avoid. So what can we do in place? Well, my advice is to seek structural engineers before we even start. Maybe that's the client, the demolition contractor, On this project, where we see DDS, 2 separate structural engineers were employed in this one, and they got good advice to bring it down. All right, so for me, get good structural advice from in there. Create exclusion zones. Why exclusion zones? Because we know buildings fail, especially under demolition, they can fail. Use mechanical machines where possible that's away from the building, that if it does fail, no one's going to get hurt. Okay, Ange? Okay. Different types of also ones we see are being used is deconstruct. How do we deconstruct it? Well, we basically follow the reverse methodology of a building. Okay. Problem with this deconstruct method is one that we've got to use a huge amount of labour. And when I talk about labour, that is to put in place such things as the propping. If we're going to put in there the propping, so where are they going to do? We can see here, this is one that we was involved with in Hammersmith again, and we put some really strong propping systems in place. The problem with that is that we have to put it in place. We have to prop each truss throughout the building. Again, putting people's lives at risk going underneath there, when in fact, if we created an exclusion zone, we could bring it down without having to prop it. Okay, next one.
Just to interject very quickly there, yeah. Mike, we've had a question in from, I'm going to try and pronounce this, from Menasha in Harare in Zimbabwe, to see if this presentation will be available afterwards. Yes, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, but yes, it certainly will. We'll be putting it onto YouTube, and I will drop you a line afterwards so that you can find it and take that and use that locally. So I hope that answers your question. Sorry to interject, Mike.
Yeah, no, and I think again, going back into the sort of southern continent, again, more the concrete again are subject to more heat, cold, expansion and contraction. Again, those car parks are failing again. So we've got a situation of there was one recently in South Africa, certain ones in Africa where they've failed from in there. And what we'll do at the end, we'll be able to produce this. Mark can put it onto his website. We'll be able to put it out there, and we'll put it into a format where anyone can download it and to review it again. Again,
superb.
Again, just go back again, Angela. Sorry. Again, just on this point, and it's quite an important point, is one of my least favoured ways of taking a car park down would be a deconstruct, a basically reverse methodology build. And again, the reason for that is that we've got a lot of open edges. We're using a lot of operatives in there to take the demolition down, take it down, and we use an awful lot of propping. And the propping will either be non-sacrificial or sacrificial. When I say sacrificial, it will stay in there, it will get damaged, and it won't be able to be reused again. So again, one of the ones where me as an engineer, as a demolition engineer, I would sort of hazard to move away. One of my least favourite techniques. It can be done, and it is being used where sometimes maybe in a city centre or it's located next to another section, but it would be my least favoured way to do it. Okay.
Sorry to interject again, Mike. We've had a question there. I'm not entirely sure of the name there. It just says Facebook user. Is the postponing of concrete repair contributing to structural failure? I think you'd already touched on that, but if you'd like to elucidate a bit.
Well, we're going to touch onto that a little bit later on, but it's a great question. One of the failures that was identified with the British Car Parks Association report, Mott MacDonald did one, the HSC followed on from in there, is that what was happening is, again, I touched on before, a lot of privately owned car parks, again, cost implications from in there. So when there was a repair, the area wasn't cleaned away. It was basically put, if it was repaired, it was poorly repaired. And it wasn't sort of opened up, it wasn't sort of sandblasted in to get to the reinforcements to get a good connection for the concrete to be repaired. It was basically not repaired at all. And the other thing what we did was a lot of sort of winter, where the snow and ice was getting in between cracks, and they were not being repaired from in there. Following on from that really good question, one of the other areas was weatherproofing was not being carried out properly. So and they were using the wrong chemicals on there, and the chemicals started to corrode the concrete. So we had a double whammy. The repairs were not being carried out; they were being postponed. People were using the wrong chemicals to sort of get rid of snow and ice. That was affecting the concrete, and the weatherproofing layer on top of the car park top floor was not a correct solution. Again, started to corrode the concrete itself. So we've had a number of series of failures and effects that was on the car parks that were starting to corrode the concrete. So the question to postpone, 100%. I mean, I think that if you look in some of the car parks in the UK, which we'll see later on, an awful lot of repairs and poor maintenance has contributed to failures. I hope that answers that one. Following on from our top-down way, and then our deconstruct, is another way that we've been doing recently in the UK is explosive demolition. This was a demolition of a car park in Wakefield, which DRS Demolition employed us and the local authority. We were the principal designer, and we were also the third-party demolition. Okay, move on, please. Okay, so a really good way of demolishing car parks from in there. Explosive demolition, a lot of time and preparation, but it's really quick. The only downside for that again is that we have to drill the holes. Again, a lot of working inside of the buildings, but we can prop the building for the short term from in there. Test blast, we can test blast the column to make sure we know what the right amount of explosives we're going to put into it. There is a large exclusion zone required, local authority involvement. Obviously, you've got to get the statutory authorities in place from in there. Again, but a really, really credible way of bringing a car park, if it's unattached to another structure, we're bringing it down from in there. Nice and quick, simple. It's down 8 seconds from button to being on the ground. It's complete and it's done from there. So a really good way of ensuring demolition is being carried out safely. And again, it stops anyone being inside of it. Okay. Again,
just quickly, Mike, is there an appetite among local authorities to allow explosive demolition? As you rightly said earlier, these car parks do tend to be in city centres and town centres. Is there an appetite for that among local authorities?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we've done it. I mean, predominantly northern recently. We've done one in Oldham, Wakefield, Rochdale. There's been one recently carried out. Again, another northern city recently was carried out. I think it was Sheffield. I think it was one in Sheffield was carried out. So yeah, I mean, they are, because they understand the failure of the car parks. Obviously, if they're attached to another structure, it's going to be really difficult to bring one down. But if it's a standalone car park where it can be done, they've got an appetite because they now see the benefits of getting it cleared in a day. Okay, so they understand if you blow it, you get it on the floor, get this exclusion zone right. It's a lot of hard work for one day, but once it's on the ground, it's effectively done. There's no danger to be done one. Okay, I'll leave that one to you, Mark. But yeah, so that's one where we're doing from in there. Certainly, as we follow off from in here, is we can see what we do is for our demolition ones, we're looking about how a demolition of a car park has been taken. Where does the structural load patch need to be done? The one we've just seen blown from there, that was the structure was taken out through the middle. Simon and his team from DSR wire roped the whole of the building. So as it went down in the middle was taken down first. The wire ropes pulled in the building all the way around to making it go into its own footprint in situ from in there. So really a good complex one from in there. Again, as we can see on the photograph on the right, we can see it's geotexed all the way around to stop as much flying debris as possible from in there. We have to protect the live services, excavate all the local areas. Again, we have to worry about air overpressure. Now, if anyone doesn't know what that means, it basically, if you can imagine a cardboard box, you squash a cardboard box, the air inside the cardboard box has got to go somewhere. No difference inside of a car park. As it comes out, the pressure goes towards the local houses. So we can offset that by putting the geotex around it. We can put some shipping containers, put some straw bales in this case to stop the air over smashing the windows and creation from there. Worked really well on this one. HSC was on site all the way through this one. Okay, so they visited the site the Thursday before. They were actually on site on the day. Didn't interfere, fair play to them, and just wanted to make sure everything was okay. And then we hit the button that came down safely from there, and there was no problems. So for me, explosive demolition is a really, really positive way to get these down. Have they got an appetite? I think from relative to events, what's happened around the world and what's happened with Didcot, except for explosives, people are nervous. However, it outweighs, if you can get done properly, if it outweighs any problems in terms of having a long, unstable building being demolished in a car park. All right, so it's done very quickly, explosive. Okay, the building, once it's down, it's made safe fairly quickly. From there, a couple of hours after the explosive, the roads can reopen. Okay, the only sort of downside of it is that we've got to pre-weaken a little bit of it from in there as a potential failure, and some sacrificial propping may be required from in there. Okay, so additional protections, straw bales, shipping containers, etc. from in there. One more section and then we'll do this one from in there. So I hope that gives you an understanding of explosive demolition is a really credible way, as well as exclusion zones, that the clients, local authorities, people who own car parks, a little bit of work together with them, a little bit of planning to do that. So we're starting to see a trend now. I hope that we're starting to see a trend of what we look for demolition of car parks. Structural advice, a lot of planning, understanding what the car parks is there, where it's failing, where its strength points are, and how we best can get it down from in there. This takes planning. Again, a number of demolition projects, if we plan it, the client, the principal designer, the team involved are given the time and space to plan the demolition, it works well. What happens is when we get limited time, we get limited space from in there, that meant sometimes problems occur with demolition. Okay.
You likened this car park demolition to power station demolition earlier, Mike, and I think over the various countries and certainly here in the UK, we have ended up with sort of specialist contractors that tend to do most of the power stations. Are we headed the same way, given the very technical demands on car parks?
I think we are, Mark. I think if you look certainly in the UK, you've got your Brown and Masons, your Erith, Keltbray, some of these big companies. BSM are now doing power stations. Really, really good contractors understand it. From there, in the UK, we've certainly got a number of contractors. I mean, I've worked with DDS on quite a few car parks. Mark Bryant from JBV worked on 3 or 4 car parks with them. Really good contractors that understand how a demolition of a car park can go through. But saying that, good practice, good structural advice, good early start to the preparation work. You know, most of the demolition contractors around the world would be able to put the right principles in place. It's just that for me, I think the one thing I'd say is, for me, I've done over 50 car parks. So I understand how car parks are built, understand where they've started to fail, and I've seen them in all different states where I've been in car parks and we've walked out because they're even starting to fail them, even on an inspection run. So there is a number of contractors out there who specialise. I mean, I know, you know, Keith Plenty does plenty of car parks around there, does really good buildings from in there. So we're starting to understand how it works from in there. But I think at some point, working maybe with the NFDC or IDE or the Association of Car Parks, I think some sort of a blueprint or sort of some technical knowledge should be given out there for people undertaking car parks. And I reiterate it back a little bit, Mark. I think the client needs to be educated. The clients and the local authorities need to be educated. How can we stop a failure hurting people, whether it be the local, whether it be the demolition contractors or pedestrians walking past? Well, we can produce an exclusion zone. It's not hard to produce an exclusion zone. We can get it done fairly quickly. We can plan it, and there's enough demolition contractors out there with enough firepower. If you can bring a motorway bridge down in 18 hours, we can certainly get a car park on the floor within 48. So there's simple matters to do, but I think the client, we have to have an appetite, and somebody has to force that through, that we know they're failing and we know they're causing particular dangers to people, so we can eradicate it. A little bit of time and effort and planning will eradicate any failures. Okay. If I just do a few more slides, Mark, and then maybe we have a break.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's good for the people listening. So on my lectures that I've done in the past, certainly on structural ones, and we've got some really good demolition structural engineers out there who will also tell you that one of the areas that we look for is where in a car park have we got some strength, because we know they're starting to fail. Well, certainly one of them is in the stairwells. From there, we've definitely got some strength in there. Next one, please, Angela. Okay. No, we do go forward. Sorry. Next one. Okay. Lift shafts. Lift shafts are a great strength point for us, even if it's a traditional building, but certainly in car parks, we've got a good strength point. Again, link that to a shear wall. Generally in car parks, we've got the stairwell, we've got the lift shaft, and we've got a shear wall together. We as demolition engineers, or certainly me as I look for when I walk into a building, where's my strength point? Any high reach operator out there will tell you the one thing he looks for when he's looking for the building is what area he can go back to. Is it a central core? Is it a shear wall? Is it a stairwell? What little bit of strength has he got there to work with from in there? Exactly the same as lift shafts and car parks. But what we talked about before is they tend to be at one area to the side of the building. So we have to be mindful from there. Again, so when we come to approach a demolition of a car park, good structural advice. Where's the load paths leading? How is it starting to fail, etc. So next one, Ange. Okay. Central cores. Again, there's where all our buildings are built from, and off there with the strength. So if they're building a building and that's the central core and that's where the strength is, we can demolish back to that central point, knowing that we've got a little bit of strength in the building to keep it rigid from in there. Okay. Okay. So I don't know, Mark, if that's a good. We've been going in an hour. If that's a good place to have a 10-minute break.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I mean, we've still got people tuned in, and if anyone's got any questions now would be a good time to get them in.
Yeah.
Just a couple of things. I mean, probably a bit of a cliche to ask this, but you know, as somebody that has taken down more than 50 car parks, and you've seen them in their very worst state. When you use a car park, you know, back when we used to use car parks because we were allowed out. Do you find yourself looking more closely at them, given your experience, and do you find yourself thinking, actually, I'll park my car somewhere else?
Well, my kids go mad at me when I'm walking through car parks because I'm saying, look, that's failing, that's starting to crack, and this is going, that's not right. And yeah, I mean, I do look at car parks failing now. just at this picture, funny, before we start to move on, this was a picture of a live car park that we were about to undertake some demolition on, where it's starting to fail. And it's a bit like that. If you say to somebody now, do you ever see a green car? Well, you'll start to notice green cars. People after this presentation will start to go into car parks and will notice failure cracks. Because I can tell you now that 99, but I'm not saying maybe not 99, but certainly in the 90s, you will see large structural cracks in car parks. And as you go through your days and you go into multi-storey car, certainly not the ones, the later codes, Mark, with the later builders regs, they'll be fine. But certainly ones built after the war, up into the 70s and 80s, you will see large structural cracks appearing. And you will start to think to yourself, how is that being held up? And when we run through the next section after our break, we will see that some of the car parks are held up with non-existent reinforcing, very little reinforcing, and gravity. Some are held up with dowel bars. When I say dowel bars, small little steel bars held up with a little slot on top of it. Not even there, unfortunately, on some of them. So we have to be mindful from in there. And I said before, 4th generation of demolition contractor. Father always talks to me about a Friday afternoon scenario. And I say to him, Dad, what's the Friday afternoon scenario? Dad was a great demolition guy. And he said, what happens with the concrete team that wanted to go home early on a Friday? I say, well, what difference does that make, Dad? Well, if they didn't put the reinforcing in, they went home early. So we have to be mindful from in there of what is in there. We can't always survey the building to know exactly what's in that floor. So we have to be mindful of when we look at car parks, how they're failing. But I reiterate again, Mark, the client needs to be educated. The client needs to stop and think about how and why the car park is failing and how we can ensure that nobody gets hurt by taking the car park down.
Absolutely. And Shane has just raised a point here. And I know you talked about the fact that we're talking about heavier cars, but we've also got a lot more of them. Possibly not right now because nobody's driving. But, you know, yeah, you think back to the way that the M25 and other motorways were designed, you know, design them at 2 lanes and all of a sudden 3 and 4 and 5 weren't enough.
And if you think about Shane's point there about not just heavier cars, but more of them nowadays, well, car parks have been, you know, up until obviously the pandemic, car parks were being more and more and more heavily used in the city centres. You know, you go into, say, in London and major cities around the country and the world, it's difficult to get in because they're just being used. So they're getting a constant turnover of the floor. We're getting constant live load. Okay, so if a car is heavier, the live load is constantly moving and shifting. We're getting improper, as the point made before, maintenance. So it's not being maintained properly. We're getting a perfect storm on car park. Everything that could go wrong on car park failure is happening. And we see it on a number of areas throughout the UK of how these car parks are starting to fail. Heavier cars, more use, lack of maintenance, environmental factors, the wrong weatherproofing putting on it, the wrong materials to take the snow and ice away is starting to erode it and corrode the car parks.
It raises another couple of points. I mean, first and foremost, the more I listen to this, the more I think we should have some sort of initiative in the UK where they're all inspected. But also, I mean, we've mentioned COVID, and that's, I guess that's changing. I'd refer to it as the high street, I guess, you know, retail outlets and the sort of places where you would normally find a multi-storey car park. Given the fact that, you know, a lot of people have switched their shopping online and, you know, a lot of retail businesses will have gone out of business now. It kind of makes you wonder whether the multi-storey car park, certainly in its broadest sense, has got a future anyway.
Yeah, I think to some extent I agree with that, but I think, you know, once you know, God forbid, you know, this horrible pandemic is over, and you know, I'm sure the high street in some form will reinvent itself. Once it starts to reinvent itself, you know, car parks will start to be used again. Once car parks start to be used, taking change points again, we'll start to get a huge amount of flow of heavier, more vehicles on the car parks, producing more live load. And again, what we've got a situation of now is that the multi-storey car parks are not being used. Then all of a sudden, boom, 21st of June, we're all back open. Everyone's out there. Car parks are full again. So it's gone from no load to a full live load, and then we're starting to put more and more pressure onto the car park structures. Make a great point. Why are all these car parks not being inspected? Why is there not an independent body inspecting all these car parks and making sure that they're safe? Why is my inbox full?
I was going to say, is part of the issue the fact that these tend to be controlled locally? So it's lots of local authorities, possibly with one or two problematic and potentially failing car parks, when in actual fact what we're talking about is not a national crisis. I don't want to overstate it. I'm not scaremongering here, but if there were a car parks minister that could see the bigger picture, maybe the outcome would be different.
I don't think you're actually. I don't think you're actually scaremongering them. I think we've got a crisis amongst the car parks. I think car parks built certainly post-war through into the early 80s have got a problem, and we've seen some other car parks built into the 80s and 90s that has also shown problems of failure. So I'm not saying it's the fault of the car park owners. What I'm saying is that they need to be aware that there's been several reports carried out about poor maintenance, poor construction of car parks affecting for demolition. That then, comes back onto me. What do I get involved in day in, day out is demolition and advising clients and contractors. Therefore, clients and contractors have now got a problem that they're going to take down this failing car park, which is quite a big structure, to take it down. And they're in danger because we know they've started to fail. So we have to understand how we take them down and what we need to do. And we also need to understand is that the car park owners need to maintain their car parks in such a way that they don't start to fail. Because as of yet, touch wood, we have not had a catastrophic failure that has taken a number of fatalities. We've been close, okay, but not as of yet. So I think, again, we know the information. It's out there. They just need to act on it. And again, they need to act on car park and demolition. They need to be aware that car parks can be brought down safely, plenty of time, plenty of effort, and plenty of preparation to bring it down.
One of the reasons I was keen to do this seminar today, Mike, aside from obviously wanting to share your knowledge and expertise with those around the world that are watching, was to try and understand why car park demolition was a skill in itself. And it really does strike me, the more you speak about it, the more the fact that this is an engineering solution, isn't it? It's not just a crash bang wallop. This is a proper engineered, planned.
And anyone crass enough to go into car park demolition thinking they're easy are foolhardy. Thankfully, I mentioned before, DDS, JBV. I've worked with them on a number of car parks. Take it really, really seriously. Skilled operations. And on the one we did with DDS in Hammersmith, the different types of reinforcing. Some we didn't find any girders, any trusses, any columns. Didn't have any reinforcing in. Some had loads in. Some had RSJs in. Completely different from in there. So it's a complete engineering strategy you need to undertake. So, anyone that goes and thinks, I'll just rock up with the machine, I'll start at one end and crack on. I go re-Elvenite, 2011, touched one side of the building, the whole lot came down. Thank God no one got injured in there, okay? A bit of scaffolding got damaged, it came out of the end, but someone could have had a catastrophic injury, we could have had multiple fatalities on there. So people who think that these car parks are simple, hence why, look, I'm old enough and ugly enough nowadays to pass on my knowledge to people, right? These car parks are dangerous. They are dangerous structures to take down. They need to be thought of correctly. Anybody who just thinks they can be done simply, they've got an issue to come down. And we'll talk about the Elvenite and the South End car park collapse a little bit later on. We were actually brought in as engineers straight after it. Well, John Woodward was brought in, and we had to redesign the system how that car park came down. But there was no design. The tender went out. No demolition knowledge was passed on. No demolition consultancy. was used at the time. I think we now need to understand the client needs to be educated a little bit from in there.
We've had another question in here, which should be coming up on your screen anytime now, Mike, from our friend in Zimbabwe. Getting slightly off the topic, but given that you are a consultant and you are the expert and you've got degrees coming out of your ears, would you like to have a chat about that one?
How do you deal with the issue of asbestos and other potential hazardous chemicals on structures such as coal power plants, pre and during demolition? Well, to be fair to that question, I could do a 4-hour topic on that one. Certainly for asbestos.
Maybe we'll set up another show for that one.
Yeah, I was certainly happy to do that. Certainly, what I would say for asbestos in this one is that you tend not to have a huge amount of asbestos in the car parks apart from gaskets. The one issue that you did raise from there is the chemicals. And the chemicals that they use for getting rid of the ice and for freezing does affect the structure. And it starts to rot into the structure, and it starts to rot the steel reinforcement. Bear in mind, these car parks have only got maybe 1 or 2 very, very small gauge reinforcement bar holding sections together. They can start to rot easily. And certainly the concrete around that can start to rot. So the topic of maintenance and how the car park owners maintain it is really important in terms of chemical analysis on the concrete, especially a building that is already in failure.
When we were talking about scaremongering and trying to avoid that, you made it very clear that we are talking about a very serious problem here. How serious is that problem? I mean, are we at the point where we could have one in the UK or anywhere else actually just fail? You know, going back to the point that it is city centre, you know, you could have multiple fatalities just because of a lack of awareness at potentially government or ministerial level. Yeah.
Well, if you do the research that I've undertaken for car parks, you will see that there's been a number of reports and recommendations for car parks to be undertaken. Now, where I see a failure mark is maybe not such at the point where the catastrophic failure where the car park's in place, which we will see that, but also in people either trying to reinforce it, trying to put temporary propping in place to keep the lifespan going, and also under demolition. Now, as we move through the presentation, we're going to talk about Piper's Row. Piper's Row failed at night, so therefore, thankfully, no one was in there. The Nottingham car park failure failed during the day, but didn't kill anyone. Could easily have had multiple fatalities. It's a bit like, unfortunately, terrible thing to say, is that until there's a catastrophic failure and there's multiple fatalities, a lot of people are sort of brushing this under the floor. Now, all the people watching this presentation, next time you go into a multi-storey car park, an older one, you look for the cracks, you look for the movement joints. You'll see it. It's cracking and it's moving from in there, and you'll be shocked at the number of car parks that are in failure.
Based on all that you've said, I think I'm going to start parking on the street wherever possible.
Yeah. Some new car parks are absolutely fantastic, by the way, but some of the older ones we needed to be mindful of. Okay. Well, if you look at that picture there, Mark, you can see that's a car park in failure. Angela, if you can just move on a little bit for us. Again, we talk about one of the real major ones from in there. And again, you know, a lot of people will know John Woodward, who was the founder of C&D. You know, Wolverhampton. He knows Wolverhampton really well. And you can see there is a prime example of a car park failure. That car park failed at night. So, Mark, of your analogy, could there be multiple fatalities? You could imagine that on a Saturday afternoon, people going shopping, that failure, and if it would have forced the next floor down below, how many fatalities we could have had. Okay.
And just to be clear, just to make it absolutely clear, that Piper's Row, that was a live car park, was it? It wasn't at night, but it was live. It was still in use.
There was actually a couple of car parks left in overnight. It was a fully functional, fully working car park live. If that would have happened during the day, what you see here would have been cars and people underneath it. Okay. Hence why the HSC and the government issued a number of reports into it to find out why it failed. All right, we see here from catastrophic failure, thankfully the collapse overnight, no fatalities, fatalities. Next one, please. Okay, so these were the main findings of the reports from in there. You know, there's multiple documents. So, okay, causes of failure, poor maintenance. Well, I think one of our questions on before, what it was about maintenance. Poor nature, poor construction. Failure of the column heads due to weathering of the concrete. Overall, it created a punch and shear. Again, punch and shear is shear. Okay, you've got the concrete on top of it. The column stays in. All the reinforcing around there starts to fail. The floor starts to fail there. The shear punches through. All right, so that's what we're looking for from there. It's a punch and shear failure. Really happens from this one. Okay, and back on to the next one. Next one, please. Ange. Okay, again, moving on from Wolverhampton, one of the ones in 2017 that was happened in the UK was Nottingham car park. Again, all the parapet walls around it, as we talked about before, Mark, failed. Again, and those cars there could have had a real nasty end. Again, causes of failure: rusted steel supports, improper construction, lack of reinforcing the slab. Now, you don't need to be a rocket science to work out where I'm going with this presentation. There is a theme going through where we are. We're understanding now that how they've been built, how they've been poorly built, how they've been poorly maintained, and how they've been poorly constructed. And the lack of reinforcing is really going to come home to us as we move forward. Okay. Now, John Woodward, my predecessor, was called out to look at this one for car park, a famous car park down in Southend, 2011. Demolition contractor, no fault of their own. Given the car park, was told it was reinforced, was told it was in a failing state, but was not too bad. Causes of failure, okay, supported only by friction, no reinforcing in, purely gravity, no reinforcing at all in any of the beams and the columns. When the demolition started, the joints between the horizontal beams and the vertical columns became unstable and failed. Why? Improper construction. Failure to be certified, tested, and it went from in there. So where we talk about, Mark, about the risk to the general public going into a car park, totally agree. The Piper's Row shows that there could be a failure, there could be a catastrophic failure, and there could be a number of cars, people, pedestrians, anyone in there could be killed. This lecture is about how we take down car parks. So for my concern is the demolition operative going to have to work on these jobs needs to know that there's potential for failure of car parks under demolition. And it's been happened, and it was proved in 2011 from in there. Okay, next one, Ange. Okay, so one of the things that we've looked at, Mark, is why and how we can do. So what sorts of things can we do pre-start? Okay. Well, we need to understand how the building is reacting. Is it in imminent failure? Is it in imminent failure to collapse? Or is it just showing signs of distress? So we need to carry out, and the client needs to carry out, a pre-demolition survey, a pre-demolition structural engineer. Now, we've got some great demolition engineering companies, Andems, etc., in the UK, who can go and survey a building to carry out to it prior to demolition. What do we need to know? How is it going to react? And I think the client at this stage needs to be spending money in the right one to find out what state the car park is in. All right. Okay. We talk about taking out floor loads or structural testings. What is the floor loading? How is the structural going in there? Is there any reinforcing in there? To find out, was there any reinforcing installed? As Southend proved that a number of car parks didn't even have reinforcing in. If it was to fail, would it fail badly? Okay, how is the reinforcing affecting the columns? Next one, Angela. Okay. Again, we talk about good questions from in there. When we look at a car park, is it in imminent failure? If demolition commences, would a catastrophic failure occur? Would a full exclusion zone around the building be put in place? Well, from my point of view, if I'm a local authority or a client given a car park to be demolished, I've seen them fail. Why would I not ask for an exclusion zone to be put in place? Yes, the pedestrians have got to cross over to the other side of the road. Well, I mean, that's a real big hardship for the pedestrians. Sorry, that's me being facetious. But if it saves someone's life and it saves an accident and it gives the demolition contractor a bit more space and room, that's what we should do. Yeah. And again, this was the car park in Hammersmith. Before we started, we surveyed the floors. We understood the reinforcing, what was in there. And as you can see, all the reinforcing in there is very, very thin gauge reinforcing. Okay, Ange? Okay. So, other advice that we need to do for takes of car parks. Have we got to put some propping in place? Is the propping going to be, sacrificial? Is it going to be temporary? How are we going to support the car park? As we've seen before in that DDS video, when they took the car park down, they'd done some sacrificial propping and they did some floor loading proppings from in there. Again, where do we look for? Where have we got some strength in the building? Okay. Again, we see on the right-hand side photograph, instead of producing a punch and shear failure, which could happen from in there, they've actually produced a column. They've actually put steel work around the column. So they've actually created a collar around the column holding up the slab. So it's preventing it failing. Again, good pre-demolition advice, good pre-demolition techniques to ensure when they come to do the demolition, it's safe and sound and the building will remain rigid. What the downside of that is, it costs money. It costs a little bit of time to put it in place. But that is the only downside to this sort of thing. Prep work and pre-demolition structural advice is vital for when we take down car parks. Okay. Again, different types of propping techniques. Okay, Ange. And again, what questions do we need to ask? Has the building or the car park suffered structural loss? Now, structural concrete, has got a shelf life. It will only, survive for so long. Is it starting to fail? Is it losing loss of strength? Okay. Was the reinforcing put in place? And how we can do that? But there's a number of ways that we can do it, and it's pretty inexpensive. We can take some core samples. Let's see what the strength of the building is. Let's take multiple core samples and see what reinforcing is. Then we can do a compression test to see what type of strength is left in the floor or the floor slab. Okay. And moving forward now, we've got to the fact that we can X-ray the floor slab. Okay, we can do a meter by a meter. We can X-ray the floor. We can ensure that we can see what reinforcing is in there. If there's no reinforcing in there, well, we know we've got a problem when it comes to demolition, and then we may have to create an exclusion zone. We can have to do it under maybe emergency conditions, but we know we're now armed with information before we start demolition, what's in that car park. Big risks, I think you were talking about before, Mark, as car parks over a period of time have been subject to huge weather conditions. Very little, as Shane said before, structural maintenance has been carried out on the car parks. Car parks have been put under tremendous pressure by more cars being used, heavier cars, so the point and live load is changing on a constant basis. They are, especially lift slab car parks, prone to collapse due to the nature of the design and the open spans on the car park. So we've got a real challenge when we come to take a car park down. Again, just a photograph of the job we were doing there, taking the car park down. Large spans, really, really, really thin columns holding up the floor. Bear in mind, we're talking about a car park that could hold 500,000 up to 3,000 cars. The structure is pretty poor. Okay. Now, I think one of our people asked before about concrete failure. Well, there's a slab that's failed onto the ground, and I can tell you now is that a number of our people listening to this one or will listen to it in the future will go into car parks and we'll see that in a car park. Okay, next one, Ange. And again, slabs, so concrete planks being put onto concrete trusses. Again, we see the very, very thin bits of reinforcing that is holding them together. Over a long period of time, these can fail, and once they go into fail, again, we start to see again, corrosion of car parks, purely water being absorbed into the concrete that's dripped round, and it started to create the fail. We can see the reinforcing coming through there, and we get a perfect storm, pardon the pun, of the concrete reinforcing. Okay, Ange? Okay. So, I think we've got through the car park, the timing quite well, Mark, with an hour and 20. So conclusions on my thoughts as a demolition engineer, taking over 50 car parks down, a lot of experience, worked with some great demolition people in the UK, watching and taking in car park techniques. Okay, so where are they located? Town centres, city centres around the world. Why they've been used there? Because people come to the centre for the cars to go in there. Okay. We've got limited access around them due to the close proximity of other town city centre locations. We now know that they're generally in failure. We know they've been poorly constructed. We know that a number of reports has found that the corrosive weather is starting to corrode the concrete, and the strength points that we normally find in the centre of a building are located to one side, again giving strength to one section of the car park, but the rest of it leaving it slight in flux. So the car parks have a pure number of reasons why they're starting to fail, why they need to be demolished, and these are the things that we need to look at going forward. Okay, Ange? So again, what are we looking for? What do I look for as a demolition engineer? Well, utilise remote demolition practices. Can we use high reaches, large machines to take it away? Has the client got the guts to go to the local authority and say, you know what, we've seen a number of these car parks fail around the world, let's put an exclusion zone in, let's get this unsafe building down in 48 hours, let's be done with it, let's stop any potential failure, let's make sure we eradicate any loss of life of a demolition contractor, anyone walking past the site if a catastrophic failure happens, let's produce a really nice, strong exclusion zone. We talk about avoiding human exposure. Well, if we've got to go in and prop the building, if we've got to go and take the building down on a top-down or floor-by-floor basis, are we putting people's lives at risk? Well, if we are, let's make sure that we've got the right structural advice to back prop it. Before we even start, let's make sure we consult the right structural engineers, ones with really good demolition knowledge. Employ the correct temporary works methodologies. Are we going to use sacrificial propping? Are we going to use maybes? Are we going to use strong boys? How are we going to support the building under demolition? And remember, the precedent's been set. We're not reinventing anything here. We know buildings have failed. We know buildings have failed under demolition, and we know buildings have failed pre-demolition. We have a number of real case studies to go to the client, the local authority, and the HSE, and say, we think this building's under failure. Our best would be to produce an exclusion zone, use high reach excavators or large excavators to bring it down in a safe and controlled manner. And again, you know, a number of ways that we've done. Once it's done right, okay, Angela? Once it's done right, it's done safely, we do away with the risk of it. And as we say for us here at C&D, you know, demolition is an art, okay? It's a science. You know, we want to make sure that we as the industry are forewarned and forearmed with knowledge such as this on car parks before we start it to move forward, okay? And hopefully that's give a little bit of an insight into car park demolition and my thoughts and our thoughts at C&D. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to take it over now or in the future. Or Mark, if you want to put something on there, we would be we'd be happy to answer any questions moving forward. And Shane, that's really appreciative that to get some good feedback like that. That's it makes what the sort of 5 days of preparation for this one and my staff here all worthwhile. But yeah, thanks for those comments. That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, while we're waiting just to see if any more questions do come in, Mike, one of the things that strikes me with this is, obviously, you know, we are talking on behalf of the demolition industry, and we are talking predominantly to the demolition industry. All that you've said here, you know, when you think about top-down methodology, when you think about backpropping and temporary works, and even just drilling for the potential blasting of a car park, all of this means that we've found a building that's, as you describe it, under failure, and we're sending demolition men and women into that.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's got to be a better way, hasn't there?
There has. And, you know, when I went to that meeting a few years ago with Mark Bryan from JBV, and I walked in and I said to the council, well, what you know what you need to do here, don't you? And he said, what's that? I said, just need to close these roads off for a weekend. And his face was a picture as if I'd asked him to, you know, do some heinous crime. All I wanted him to do was say, close the road down for 2 days, get the building down safely, put it on the floor, and then we can clean up. And he was aghast, but I had the audacity to ask for a road closure. And it took about 4 weeks for us to convince them that this was the safest way to do. We closed it off, we put it in the local press, we got on the local news, we told everyone on the radio where we're going to close it down. Lo and behold, started Friday night, Sunday morning we were done. And that is the mindset we need clients and local authorities to get out of. Why would you risk your son or your daughter to go into a building to do preparation work when it can be avoided? Now, if it has to be done, that way, let's make sure it's done with the most safest method. We've got the right structural engineers in place. We understand how the propping is done. So if we have got to take it down by a top down, we know it's safe. We know it's rigid. We know it's not gonna fail. And that's the bit what we have to do. And again, I think sometimes complacency is a really, really tough word in demolition. I think some people sometimes get complacent, and not just demolition contractors, not just demolition contractors, because we're really good in the UK. But what we need to do is the authorities are complacent about, yeah, okay, I'll just put a tender out, I'll put it onto a portal, I get 150 demolition contractors to come and bid for it, I get the cheapest price, and we'll press the button on Monday and expect them to take the building down on Tuesday. You know, that is the complacency I'm talking about. But not all local authorities, because we act for a lot of local authorities. If they plan it right, they understand what the use of a demolition consultant is needed. Not just us, there's other demolition consultants out there who do just as good a job as us and just as big a knowledge as car parks of us. Use them to ensure that when the tender goes out, that the right methodology is being used. Have we thought about it from in there? And I think that will get away from it. But Mark, you're right. Let's stop putting people in the coalface. Let's keep away from the danger.
Oh, interesting. This kind of leads me to the last time that you and I spoke, because you, obviously with your academic side of your business or your personal life, you've been sort of scanning the horizon for what comes next in the field of demolition. And, and I know you touched on robotics and that kind of thing. You know, robotic machines are the answer in some of these cases, aren't they?
I give you a classic example. I'm not going to name the contractor. I was asked by a contractor recently to undertake some demolition in an 8-storey building, and the area where the machine was going to go, there was a chance of failure. The building, we put a block in there because the floors, we expected the floors to go. The block fell down two floors. We expected it to fail, but we took it from in there. The client was a little bit concerned about why we've done it, and we knew that the machine was going to fail in there. So in terms of robotics moving forward, you know, there's no reason why we can't use robotics and remote demolition in car parks if we have to, and robotics will start to come more and more and more into the field. I know the demolition machine driver who's probably listening to this thinking, oh no, it won't. Well, your skill will just be as needed in the future using the robotic side of a block or an excavator, but we can do it remote control. And anyone who says to me, oh, well, you don't get the right feel, absolutely correct. You don't get the same feel as when you're driving, because I used to be a machine driver myself. However, one thing that we can say is that you'll go home at night. And that's my biggest concern, is that everyone comes to work in the morning and goes home. So the fact that we can do a number of things moving forward with robotics to make sure that everybody goes home safe at night is the one. Now, I'm sure I'll get plenty of criticism for me saying, you know, robotics could take the away from machine. Well, in certain cases, robotics should take away a human from doing a difficult job and putting himself in danger. Where there's no need to do it, that's fine, get back in the machine. But where there's danger, robotics is certainly the way forward. And my PhD that I'm starting to do now is all about the future of demolition and what we're looking for. And robotics will play a huge part of it in the next 50 years. And what will also happen is this the sort of Xbox generation. They will be quite important moving forward, because they will be the people who will be able to work and use remote control demolition going forward, plans in the future.
We in demolition are kind of picking up and clearing up the mess of sort of bygone eras and maintenance failures and that kind of thing. So it's highly unlikely that Boris Johnson is watching now. I think he's probably got bigger fish to fry right about now. But assuming he was, what would you say to him? You know, if you could take a government minister to one side and say, you've got an issue with car parks, what would you say to them?
Well, I think I'd say to them that there's been an issue. You've known about it since 1977. You've known about it since 1972 when building regs and codes come into it. You've known about it since 2017 with Nottingham from it. What I would say is that a fundamental review of all car parks within the UK should do it. Now, who pays for that fundamental review? That's beyond my pay scale. But certainly the car park associations, the people who run, should only be licensed. And we've talked to me and you before, Mark, about licensing either the demolition industry and other, as the asbestos company. If you're going to open a car park or have a car park open, me as a general paying public wants to know that that car park is safe. So it should have a license to it. So it should say to someone, this car park is safe. Every year it's been structurally tested, and it's got a certification to say this car park is safe. Now that's what I think we should have in the UK, that every single car park that people pay to put their car in there, we should have a license for it, and it should be safe.
No, totally agree, Mike. I think we've exhausted all the questions and probably exhausted all the audience as well.
Yeah,
I'd love to think we can do something again in the very near future, maybe with yourself or one of your colleagues, maybe on a different subject, because there is a demand for this.
I suppose what I would say for Mark, if there is a demand for it, maybe let the people viewing it or tell us what they'd like to be on the subject on. You know,
good idea.
If they tell us that they would like this subject to be on, say, power stations, or they would like it to be on sort of top down or some tower blocks, or they'd like it to be on conventional demolition or city centre demolition, or I know we've got one of the questions on asbestos. If you wanted to do maybe asbestos in demolition, or lead, or anything, any topic that they'd want to do, we could say I'm prepared. Again, we don't get paid for doing this. We do it because we love the industry, and I love to pass on the knowledge, and I like to talk, as you can tell. But I like to sort of pass on the knowledge to people moving forward. And if my knowledge is taken up by one person and it helps one person in the street, well, I'll be a very, very happy person from these ones. So you tell us what you want me to do a lecture on, and every quarter, if we do, I'm happy to do one every quarter or whenever the demand is.
I hope you found that enjoyable. I hope you found it interesting and informative. We will be uploading this video or the recording of this show to YouTube in the next couple of minutes or the next hour or two, because it's going to take a while, because it's quite a big file, I think. If you've got any more questions, you can find me. Just about there, demolitionnews.com. that's the best place to start, but you can see my email address going across the bottom of the screen there. If you would like any more information, or as Mike suggested, if you would like to suggest topics for future seminars, please let us know. We'd love to do more of these. In the meantime, thanks ever so much for watching. Thanks for taking part. Thanks for your questions. Thanks also to Amicus, to Shane and the team at Amicus for sponsoring this and making this possible. Thanks to Mike and to Angela, who was working away in the background there, making it all work. I'll be back here again tomorrow, which is my birthday. I'll be back here tomorrow at 10 a.m. for the Breakfast show, but hopefully we'll be back at some point in the future with some more educational content as well. In the meantime, have a great day. Stay safe. If you're going into a car park, look out for those cracks. If you find any, report them, or better still, call Mike, because he is Mr. Car Park. Thanks for watching.
If you enjoyed this show, please consider supporting us. Go to buymeacoffee.com/demolition news.